Welcome back to the channel, y'all. Today I want to dive into the scandal that has embroiled the Bureau of Labor Statistics over the past couple of weeks. This is about new revelations that have come forward that BLS may have probably cooked the books in terms of how many jobs have actually been added to the economy. Trump was not pleased with this, so he actually fired the chief head over at Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they're probably going to find someone else. But if you're not familiar, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the main economic data center within the government. It's really important to coalesce economic data because that information is used by financial institutions, private equity firms, venture capitalists, banks, all sorts of folks to determine how the economy is doing. They have data on new jobs that are added and price increases, so inflation. So they're basically the bureau within the government that's in charge of collecting all the data that the Federal Reserve then uses to determine whether or not to increase interest rates. So this is pretty significant stuff that's coming out because if you've been paying attention, the Fed has consistently kept interest rates high on the expectation that inflation will continue, but also because the numbers had suggested a strong labor market. Well, I've been saying this for a while. I think a lot of others have too. The labor market isn't really what it seems. I personally think we are already in a recession. We have been for a while now. It's just the data hadn't really kept pace with what was happening on the ground in Main Street America. I think now, though, things might be different. So How Money Works recently released a video all about this, and I wanted to dive into it. If you don't follow them, really fantastic channel that dives into all sorts of economic issues. So let's roll.
Late last week, President Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics after they released their quarterly jobs report. The BLS, which is primarily responsible for collecting and presenting job market data, presented a report that was less than flattering about the current state of the economy for average workers. In response, the president claimed that he had issues with the economic numbers for a long time, and that he believed the recent report was phony. Now, hot take alert, but he is most likely absolutely right, just not in the way that he thinks. The July report estimated that the economy had added an extra 73,000 jobs, which was already below expectations. But the real news was that when the BLS ran the numbers again, they realized that they had overestimated May's job creation by 125,000 and June's by 133,000.
Okay, so this is pretty significant, right? This is telling us that the jobs we think are being created in the economy aren't. And a lot of times politicians, Trump included, will look at the jobs reports and they'll chalk it up to a political win. So a lot of the time, Washington really works based around this. It's not about really serving their constituents in the way you think. It's about jobs. Everyone wants to bring jobs back home to their district. That's a sign that you're doing well. If you are in a district and you are in dire economic straits and you're not bringing jobs, you're not doing your job and you're going to lose re-election. So a lot of the game for politicians in Washington is to create jobs. And, they don't always do that in the best ways possible, right? So a lot of times you'll have bills that pass through, the One Big Beautiful Bill just passed not too long ago, and you'll have people cram all sorts of different stuff into those types of bills. And, it's called pork spending. And that's how you get insane defense contracts, right? Things that take a really long time, inefficiencies. The goal, unfortunately, is job creation, job maintenance. So yeah, maybe spending millions of dollars on a new fighter jet isn't great for the macro economy. But it is for communities where those manufacturing facilities are located because that means jobs. So the fact that the jobs are lower is startling, but something I also wanted to call your attention to is that for several years now, a lot of new job creation has been highly concentrated in just a few sectors of the economy. So 3 big ones: government, hospitality, and travel leisure, and then healthcare. And the problem with data like this is that it doesn't tell you the quality of jobs being created. So I guarantee you, if you parse through the numbers with healthcare, a lot of those jobs are going to be low paying jobs. So we're looking at home health aides, probably nurses, that kind of stuff. It's not like the economy is minting out a bunch of 6-figure surgeon jobs every year, right? It's more support, help, administrative jobs that are being created. Those are typically low paying. Same with hospitality, right? So if you think, tourism, all that kind of stuff, the jobs created in that industry are housekeepers or, servers or, people who work at hotels. Like, it's all sorts of different stuff that relate to that. They're not high paying jobs. They're not jobs that someone with a college degree should be, necessarily looking to get once they graduate. So you look at that, you look at the healthcare jobs that are being created, you look at the hospitality jobs that are being created, and then obviously government was a big driver with Doge and those cuts. Like, those jobs aren't necessarily, we're not creating jobs in the government anymore. But the fact that the government is one of the top 3 job creators really shows that they're cooking their own books. It's really easy to show a positive economy if the government is the one who's employing a lot of people, because you can hide a lot of the real data that's happening in the private sector. So reality is new jobs aren't being created. So you have tech that is destroying jobs left and right. You have lots of people who are struggling to find new jobs. Yes, you have a whole new burgeoning AI sector that may create some jobs, but I'm skeptical that it will create enough jobs. But regardless, the rest of the economy isn't creating the jobs everyone thinks it's creating. So if you've encountered ghost jobs, if you've been unemployed and you're struggling to find work, there's a structural reason for it. The economy just isn't creating jobs. There isn't really an incentive to create jobs anymore. And so the fact that they've reduced their numbers by such substantial amounts really, I think, reflects what has been happening on Main Street for a really long time. It's just, there's so many different ways to manipulate data to show the outcome that you want, that I think that's what's largely been happening up until now. Is it's not even just, for political wins, and it's not because like the BLS folks were out to get Trump. Like, part of it too is their jobs are on the line. So clearly the chief that recently got fired, well, there you go. Like, she didn't do a very good job with the numbers. She lost her job. So they have an incentive to put out data, regardless of whether it's correct or, representative of what's happening in the economy, because their jobs are on the line too. So there's a lot of reasons why the jobs data can be manipulated. It's not all malfeasance. It's not all deliberate or manipulative. It just kind of is how it is. But it's important to pay attention to these discrepancies, because I think underlying all of this is the reality that we have a hollowed out economy that isn't creating nearly as many jobs, or at least as nearly as many good paying jobs as people would like to think it is.
That means that more than 250,000 jobs that we thought existed never did. And that was just over 2 months. These major readjustments have cast some doubts over the already disappointing numbers from this month, and for many people, it's reconfirmed what they were already thinking. The economy is a lot worse than the numbers are telling us.
The latest jobs report was far worse than expected.
President Trump accused the Bureau's commissioner of rigging the numbers to make himself and fellow Republicans look bad.
Millions of qualified workers hitting the streets every day searching for jobs, but getting rejected.
I got rejected by Taco Bell and Sam's Club.
Making economic policy or business decisions without reliable data is like trying to fly a plane without reliable instruments. It's just not going to work. By their own admission, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government agencies in charge of collecting data have produced less reliable numbers over recent years, and it's only getting worse. A week before releasing the controversial jobs report, the Bureau made another press release talking about major compromises they were making in the collection of consumer prices. This data is used to make the Consumer Price Index, which is what they use to measure inflation, so it's kind of important. To make matters worse, everybody from politicians to venture capitalists have started jumping in to provide solutions to a problem they really don't understand. But there are 3 big reasons why these compromises are being made in the first place, and 3 reasons why it's probably only going to get worse. The first reason is that markets are changing faster than ever, and traditional agencies are struggling to keep up with new economic realities. For example, the jobs report that is suddenly stirring up so much controversy is really 2 different surveys: the Establishment Survey and the Household Survey. The Establishment Survey is what was getting so much attention, and it works by asking thousands of businesses and government agencies how many people they have on their payroll for that month. Now, these surveyed businesses supposedly include small, medium, and large employers, but this already presents some challenges. Large employers are more likely to have dedicated human resource departments that can respond to these surveys as part of their full-time job, whereas small businesses on average aren't as timely if they bother doing it at all. The actual survey only takes about 20 minutes, and for a lot of larger companies, it's built in automatically to their payroll software. But for a small business owner already putting in long weeks, a 20-minute survey on payroll statistics often isn't the best use of their time. Even if they do respond to this completely optional survey, it's usually not until after the report has already been published. According to the Bureau themselves, they have been publishing recent reports with as little as 55% of the total eventual collected data, and it's only getting worse every year.
So this is a big thing. This is why the data has been incorrect. Again, I don't think there's evil, nefarious people sitting in Washington, D.C. being like, oh, how can we cook the books? I think it's just the way we collect data hasn't caught up with reality and just the way society is moving forward. And I speak about this from the context of having worked in DC, and just things were so outdated. I worked a job in Department of Defense, and just the way we organized information, the way we processed information, the way I had to combine information. I'd have to write reports and different representatives from different offices within the Department of Defense, outside Department of Defense. I would have to collect all these inputs and then collate them into a Word document. It was just so inefficient. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that this is happening. Everything in the country is based on survey data. Think about the census. You think about all this stuff, inflation, payroll, and how many jobs are being added. Like, all of this is being collected by voluntary surveys. Same with like political polling and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I always say this, but like, I've never been asked to participate in any of these. So I don't say that as like, oh, I haven't been asked, therefore it's not right. It's like, I haven't been asked. I don't know anyone else who's ever been asked, so I don't know who they're asking. And this video raises a really good point, is if you own a small business, like, your time is being pulled in so many different ways. It's really hard to respond to this kind of stuff. And frankly, I think it's the small businesses who are the ones who are actually creating jobs. They're the actual engines of economic growth on Main Street, right? Not Wall Street. So the ones that have established HR departments who can respond to this stuff, who are using expensive software at the enterprise level to automate their responses for them, those are going to be, bigger companies, your Amazons, your Walmarts, companies that aren't maybe creating jobs, but I would be skeptical of that. How much of Amazon's workforce is actual new job creation, and how much of it is just recycling jobs from people who have left because they have such high attrition rates? So there's a lot of questions to ask about, where is this data coming from? Who's providing it? Is it representative? If you're only getting certain, businesses to respond in certain sectors of the economy, maybe they're geographically located in certain areas, it's not representative at all. And so this is why it's really important. Yeah, like, we need to have data like this and to be able to evaluate it, but also to use our eyes. Look around. Like, you live in your local economy. You know what's going on here in Austin. I can tell you right now, the housing market's not great. How do I know? Because every street has signs up. The leasing offices at new apartment buildings have balloons and banners and free rent. In my neighborhood, tons of signs up. Some houses are up for lease, some are for sale, but it's clear people are trying to sell houses. So that tells me, like, the housing market probably isn't good. So you take that observational data, you combine it with maybe something else, whether it's a private source of data or government data, but you combine all these different inputs together, and then you draw a conclusion on where they overlap. So I think that's really important to consider. But I think it's good to know that a lot of this data is voluntary. It is from surveys, and it's not really a true representation of what's happening in the economy.
To account for this difference, the BLS uses imputed data, which is just a nice way of saying guessing based on previous results. If they are still waiting on lots of small businesses to provide their data, they will look at what small businesses have said in the past compared to large businesses that have already provided their responses, and use that to make their report. As any good finance bro will tell you, past performance is always the best predictor of future results. Now, hopefully you all know I am joking, but this system is normally good enough for most months. But the times where this strategy really suffers is during periods of rapid change. Small businesses feel the impacts of bad economic conditions faster and are normally the first to either let go of staff or go out of business completely. So, if reports are only using data from big businesses and then guesstimating the rest, then they won't notice these job losses until they have to go back and do revisions, like what is happening right now. Now, this has been the case since the survey was first conducted. Not to sound too alarmist, but these massive downward revisions were last consistently seen during the run-up to the global financial crisis. But what's changing now is that smaller businesses are just responding less overall, and there are a lot more of them. The rate of new business creation has increased massively since the pandemic. In the past, these were normally real businesses that had a good chance of creating real jobs for real people, and we are still imputing economic data based on that old assumption, when really what most of these new businesses actually represent is people registering for their side hustle as an Uber driver in the gig economy.
So this is partly true. I think another thing that is also true that isn't covered in this is that a lot of new business creation is also in the tech sector, and it's startups, and it's these like, I don't even want to call them businesses, and I'm sorry if you're in tech, but like these companies, you have these 20-somethings who've gotten a ton of venture capital, and they're building these apps and websites and features. So all these SaaS products, things that aren't really designed to employ people. Like the goal of startup bros in Silicon Valley right now isn't to build a company that can compete with, Google or Anthropic or X or any of these big companies, because they just don't have the resources. And I think they know that. The goal is to get acquired, right? So you want to build something that is of value to Facebook, so Facebook acquires you. Or that's valuable to Google, so Google acquires you. So the goal is an acquisition. I know in some cases it has been IPO. I think for a lot of gig economy companies that was like that. But if you're building a software or an app, I think the goal for a lot of these folks is to become acquired as quickly as possible. And so they're not in the business of job creation, right? The more people you have on your headcount and on your payroll, the more you're going to burn through your capital, and the harder it is to get your product to market. So there's a disincentive to create jobs. So I think it's absolutely true that folks who are registering in the gig economy as Uber drivers and DoorDash drivers and the like, they're being counted as businesses, but they're not actually creating jobs. It's because they're self-employed. Myself too. Like not at the moment anyways, maybe someday, but I'm not employing anyone. Like I work for myself, so I'm self-employed, but I'm not hiring anyone. I'm not creating any jobs. So I think this is a problem, is you have where there's growth in the economy, there isn't job creation. So Silicon Valley startups aren't creating jobs. If you're a solo person just driving for Uber, you're not creating a job. And then the companies that do have the resources to respond to this data, your Amazons and your Walmarts of the world, they're not necessarily creating jobs either, because there's no way to parse through their attrition rates and actual new job creation. Again, the books get cooked. I'm not saying it's deliberate, but it makes it such that it seems like there's more jobs being created in the economy than what's actually happening.
Not only goes a long way to explaining declining survey response rates, because your average person driving Uber isn't going to fill out a BLS survey, but it also creates two bigger problems. The first is that it overestimates real job creation based on outdated assumptions. And the second is that even if this data was accurate, it doesn't capture a more pressing reality. We could create 1 million new jobs next month, and it won't do you much good if you are working 3 of them and still can't afford to make ends meet. And so far, all of this is just one report. There are dozens of agencies across America and the rest of the world that are failing to properly account for changing financial realities. So it's time to learn how money works to find out if we can trust our economic data and what it means if we can't. This week's video was made possible by us and our new Spotify page. If you would prefer to listen to these videos or watch them ad-free, the link is in the description. There are a lot of government agencies dedicated to producing data on how the country and the economy is doing. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is the one cog in the machine that is making headlines at the moment, but other agencies like the Census Bureau, the Treasury, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, the Department of Agriculture, as well as the data collecting branches of the IRS and the Fed all rely on each other to produce reliable numbers that they themselves put into their own calculations. For example, when the Bureau of Economic Analysis produces GDP data, about 70% of that is based on consumer data collected by the Census Bureau in their retail trade surveys. Interagency data sharing, as this is known, is not a result of laziness, but rather a feature of the system so that every department is overlooking every other department. But you can probably start to see the problems. Uncertainty in any part of the system creates uncertainty in the entire system, and that can be really useful for certain groups. The first are politicians who get to cast doubt on numbers that might make them look bad. But let's be honest, they never let numbers get in the way of a good spin anyway. The second group are large investment firms with access to their own proprietary data collection techniques. A report from a data firm published by Newswire estimated that investment management firms could spend as much as $15.4 billion this year on alternative data, which really just means anything not published publicly by government agencies or the media. That is 20 times the annual budget of a department like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These firms are regularly employing tactics like using private satellite imagery or just running their own surveys where they will actually pay participants for more timely responses.
So when people talk about data and the importance of data in today's economy, this is what they're talking about. Every time you use something, a website, a free app, whatever, they're harvesting your data. They're collecting it. Everything you do, your data is being collected. So this is why I think it's really important to pay attention to how you are giving away your data, who you're giving it away to, because it's all being monetized in a private market that you're completely oblivious to. And as you saw, it's worth billions of dollars. So I think taking more care of your data is becoming more important than ever before.
The better their data is compared to the publicly available data released by government agencies, the more they can make on that data asymmetry. Now, you might think this sounds a little bit like insider trading, but it's not. Technically, the information they are collecting is out there for anybody to collect, and it's not their fault if the average goober on Robinhood doesn't have access to a fleet of spy satellites to collect it. This creates the second major problem with our economic data. It's more profitable to privatize the numbers. The BLS, for example, has 10% fewer staff and a 15% lower budget than it did in 2010 following the global financial crisis, after accounting for inflation. Now, that doesn't sound terrible, but the scope of its operation has also grown considerably in that time, making its job a lot harder overall. The fewer resources they have to actually go and collect primary data, the more they have to rely on guesstimations based on historical correlations. An article, ironically, published by Bloomberg last week, reported that the agency would no longer be collecting consumer prices from certain rural regions due to budget constraints. According to the report, the volume of data they are effectively making up has more than tripled in the last 6 months alone.
Wow,
the reason this is so ironic is because Bloomberg is one of the biggest data retailers in the world.
Yep.
Every one of those black and orange screens filled with random spreadsheets and stock charts you see in videos on trading floors is a Bloomberg terminal. Each one of those computers costs about $30,000 a year in an ongoing subscription. And the reason that big investment firms pay that much is because it gives their staff access to information that just isn't available to regular people. Anyway.
Okay, also, side note here too. This is why I am super opposed to just frivolous retail investing. I used to do a lot of personal finance writing and would promote products created by personal finance creators, courses especially, where it encouraged people to empower themselves by learning about investing and engaging in investing. This is the problem. You're never going to make what you think you're going to make day trading, investing, because you don't have access to the data that the folks with Bloomberg terminals do. If you want a Bloomberg terminal, I think you can get one. But like they said, it's really expensive. But you're always going to get seconds. You're going to get second pick to everything. In all sorts of different reasons, because you don't have access to data, because you're not a preferred investor, all sorts of stuff. So you're never going to have access to the markets you think you have access to. And so a lot of these financial companies like Robinhood and stuff, they market this idea of financial empowerment and investing. In reality, they're there to sell financial products to you on the promise of making a lot of money so they can collect fees. A lot of them do this. So yeah, and important to understand, again, where data comes from and why it's important. It not only shapes, the government and policies, the Fed's decision whether or not to raise interest rates, which affects, mortgages and things like that. But it also affects your ability to really play the game. You're never going to be able to invest like folks on Wall Street. Institutional investors will always have the upper hand, and that's just how it is. So just a side note there.
Budget cuts can create a vicious but convenient cycle for these parties. These departments have their budgets cut, so they don't have as many resources to collect reliable reports. These unreliable reports with big adjustments are then used to show how pointless these departments are, so they get their budget cut even more. The average voter doesn't really understand what these people do. The average politician doesn't like having their work critiqued, and the average industry group would love it if they had a monopoly on good, reliable data. And that's the third major problem that's quickly getting much worse. Even if these numbers were absolutely flawless, are they even relevant anymore? There are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. It's a quote so old that nobody even knows who originally came up with it anymore, but it's remained relevant for hundreds of years. A survey that I ran on all of you while I was putting this video together found that an overwhelming majority did not think that current economic statistics were an accurate reflection of the real economy. Most people who are paying any attention to these numbers while still living in the real world inherently understand this. The idea that what is causing this disconnect is a secretive group of statisticians plotting away behind the scenes to make politicians look bad is frankly pretty dumb. But there is actually an element of truth in it. A report by Cambridge University found that as we have become more politically polarized and less likely to answer surveys, only the most partisan among us actually bother responding to be counted in the data.
That's interesting.
A business owner who supports a party currently in power is much less likely to respond to a survey with negative economic implications, and they are much more likely to respond if they have good news to share, like having hired new staff. It's less exciting than a shadowy conspiracy, but it is still a problem. Unfortunately, it also just distracts from the bigger problem. A lot of attention is being paid to the referees to see if they are keeping an accurate score, but nobody has stopped to ask why they are monitoring a jousting league. A lot of the data they collect is completely outdated in today's economic landscape. For example, the conditions to count as unemployed are pretty strict, and it doesn't account for a growing number of people who are underemployed or have simply given up on looking for a job altogether.
Yeah, there was, so speaking of different data sets, the Federal Reserve in New York, they put out a report earlier this year about this, and it's super important to pay attention to this. According to their analysis, approximately 41% of Gen Z is underemployed. So if you're not familiar with what that is, it means you're working a job, so you're technically not unemployed. You're not collecting unemployment insurance per se, but you don't have a job commensurate with your college degree. So maybe you're waiting tables, maybe you're a bartender, maybe you're doing part-time work, maybe you're working in retail. So you're getting a paycheck, but it's not enough in most cases, and it isn't commensurate with what your college degree was for. And so I think that's a really important indicator that, as they talk about here, it's not counted at all in the economic data. So everyone talks about the unemployment numbers like 4.2% or something like that. And if you look at underemployment or even people who are working multiple jobs, it highlights that for the average person, the economy is in a far worse condition than what folks on Main Street or folks in DC think it is.
Another absolutely horrible metric we have learned to think is really important is GDP per capita. A smaller channel by the name of Type Ashton did an amazing deep dive into the stupidity of this data point. So instead of ranting about it here, I will leave a link to it down below. The point is, long data series are good for assessing performance in comparison to the guy that came before, but they aren't always the best indication of how things are actually going right now. If this goes on for long enough, people will just stop caring. In fact, they kind of already have. 10 million working-age men have completely dropped out of the workforce, which is yet another example of a trend which is not captured with this data. Go and watch this video to find out why this is happening and how they are surviving without an income. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Yeah, that's a huge issue too that, like they said, isn't covered in the economic data. You have millions of prime working-age men who have simply dropped out. Some of them are on disability. Some of them just, I don't even know how they're taking care of themselves, frankly. But they're so disillusioned and dissatisfied with where the world is going that they see no point in working. So they're just sitting at home, literally in their mom's basement, playing video games. And, that's kind of the way it is. But I wanted to call attention to the fact that I do think we are in a recession, and we have been in a recession for a while. So typically, a recession is defined as like two quarters of declining economic growth. So like 6 months worth of like declining GDP, for example. There really isn't, though, a like succinct and agreed upon definition of even what a recession is. So some people, I think that's the most commonly used one, but some people don't even agree with that. And so I think there's a couple of indicators within Main Street that I think are worth drawing attention to. Before I I do that though, I do want to call your attention to this framework. This is what I use to kind of parse through the different streets in America. So I think we have 4. We have Main Street, Wall Street, K Street, and Sand Hill Road. And all of these represent different economies. So Main Street is you and I, the average person who's just working a job, wants to support their family, going to buy groceries, takes a vacation once or twice a year, probably Disney World, maybe not even that anymore. You shop at Target, you shop sales racks, maybe you go to Whole Foods, you go out to eat a few times, but you're not, you don't have like a summer home in the Hamptons, you don't have a flat in Amsterdam, you're not carrying a Birkin bag around, you don't have a Lamborghini, like you're just a normal person, right? Then after that, you have the Wall Street economy. So those are people who are working on Wall Street. They're investing, but beyond investing, they're also betting. There's such a high degree of financialization within the world that they're betting. The Big Short is a really great movie that talks about the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. That's a really good example of people who shorted. So they bet against. They bet that homeowners would default basically on their mortgages, and then they made a bunch of money by doing that, shorting the market. So you have people who use their knowledge and data to generate massive profits off of the economy. And so they're not looking at the world the same way you and I are, because they're playing a very different game. After that, you have the K Street folks. That refers to the street where there's a lot of lobbying and law firms in Washington, D.C. Those people aren't necessarily betting on financial success. They're looking for power, and they're looking for ways to convert politics, service in the government, whatever, to power, and they're cashing in on that. So it's like if the Coca-Cola lobby and the soda lobby successfully permits, Coca-Cola to be permitted under SNAP, well, that's guaranteed revenue for that company, right? So there's power in that, there's value in that. So that's what they're playing, a game of politics and power, but they are capitalizing on it. And then the last one, Sand Hill Road. If you're not familiar with that reference, that is kind of the main corridor in Silicon Valley where a lot of venture capital and a lot of tech firms are, and they basically are providing the gas to keep that economic engine going. But kind of like I was saying before, the companies that are being created out in Silicon Valley, they're not job creators. If anything, they're job disruptors. And they're more in it for technological advancement. So folks like Sam Altman over at OpenAI, they're not in the business of, he's not in the business of creating a valuable company that provides shareholder value and creates jobs and, gives back to the country. He's creating a company. He's racing to be one of the first people to release artificial general intelligence onto the world. So he is playing for the history books. And that's what a lot of these folks in Silicon Valley are. Same with Elon Musk and all of them. They're building legacies, and they're trying to be the ones that radically transform the world. They want to be the next Andrew Carnegie's, the next Cornelius Vanderbilt's. They want, your kids and their kids and their kids' kids to read about them in the history books. So those are kind of the 4 streets, if you will, and each of those streets, based on what they're peddling and what influence they're trying to have, they're going to have a different economy. And so one of the problems with how we think about the economy is that we think of it as this one unified homogenous thing. You see data from BLS or other, government data agencies, and we just talk about the economy as this unified thing, and really it's not. It's multiple different economies based on which street you are sitting on. And for the vast majority of us, we're sitting on Main Street, whether you like it or not. Unless you are a VC, or you are building the infrastructure of an AI firm, or you have years of experience on Capitol Hill, you're probably not sitting on one of these other streets. You're not, at that level. So most of us are on Main Street, and so that's what's really important. So again, when we talk about recessions, it's, sustained decline in GDP, decline in output. And so that's often looked at a national level. And so obviously, as you saw in the video, there are reasons why folks want to cook the books in DC, and why, people make decisions based on privatized data sets. There's just a lot for them to gain in doing so. And so oftentimes this obfuscates what's really happening. So the jobs data wasn't correct. You have the Fed making decisions that impact day-to-day Americans based on this data. And here we are. So you have an obfuscation of what's really happening in the Main Street economy. So I think we have been in a recession for a good period of time now. Frankly, my thesis is I think the 2008 financial crisis was far worse than people realize. I think there were attempts to bandage it, TARP and the bailouts and all that kind of stuff. But I think it just kicked the can down the road. When you had 0% interest rates for a really long period of time, it gave capitalists in Silicon Valley free money. They could borrow with no penalties. And so they did. They grew. They created these behemoth tech companies from it. And so they were able to capitalize off of that while the rest of us, couldn't. So we're now paying the consequences of that. COVID happened, shut the economy down. That, I think, was a major turning point in the economy. You see that again with tech companies who have been laying off, but also they were talking in the video about how response rates have gone down with small businesses. And I think part of that is there are small businesses that failed immediately after COVID, and there are ones that have been trying to hang on and are in the process of failing now. And so I think we kicked the can down the road from 2008. COVID happened, and that was a major disruption to the economy. You had a major bifurcation in the interim as, Wall Street and folks in Silicon Valley were able to capitalize on really cheap money access. And now everything has changed. Credit is much higher than it used to be. The cost of doing business is a lot higher. And so there's not the job creation that we see. And I think the repercussions we're starting to experience now from inflation, from all this, is a result of policies that were put into place to manage these different crises. And I don't think that those policies actually work the way they were supposed to. So one of the big indicators that I think we're in a financial or a recession is that there's a lot of government-backed mortgages right now. And so if you're familiar with the 2008 financial crisis, this was a big issue. You had subprime borrowers, so people who had really bad credit who were able to get houses. And then you had a lot of people who were buying multiple houses. They were trying to be investors, if you will. That's been really popular for people over the past few years. And so the economy was just a house of cards. It ended up collapsing. People weren't able to make their mortgage payments. And so the government stepped in. They started backing mortgages. Well, according to data from 2023, 32% of mortgages were directly backed by government agencies, and 95% of mortgage-backed securities were issued by Fannie, Freddie, or Ginnie. Well, the government has an incentive to put you in housing, whether or not you can afford it or not, in part because that shows that things are going well. If you have an economy that's not creating jobs and people can't get housing, they get really angry, as we're seeing now. So there's an incentive to get people into housing. And so that means if the government needs to underwrite you, they will. So you have a lot of really cheap loans, FHA loans, VA loans, that make it easier for people to get into housing who actually can't afford it. And now with prices increasing the way they have, it's just made things more expensive than I think what people realize. And so this is, I wrote this back in April. So this is using data from April, but there was a guy, I've watched a couple, Reventure Consulting. He has a lot of good videos about the housing market. I would definitely check him out. But just talking about how people are starting to default on their loans, and looking at folks who are on government-backed loans is an indicator of weakness in the market, because it shows that people who, again, may be subprime, maybe not able to afford the mortgages that they got, they're being, boosted up by the government, and the government is kind of using that and hiding the reality, and that these people are over leveraged on their mortgages. Another indicator, used car prices have gone up by 31%. This is something I pulled from ChatGPT, but anyone can see this. You can't buy a used car for less than $10,000. I just paid off my car this month. I paid my last payment. I got it in 2020. It's a 2014 Subaru Outback. I think after taxes and title, everything, it cost me $13,000, and I think I had a 5% interest loan on it. And so I think I got the right time, apparently, because you can't buy a car like that anymore. There's no way you'll get the average interest rate on a used car is 19%. And I'll tell you, I worked in a bank for a period of time, and I saw the numbers and how they give loans for used cars and new cars. And there's a strong, a lot of these dealerships, they'll make money on the financing of it, not the actual car sale. And so they'll end up like the bank will say, okay, we'll give you this loan for say 4%. And then the dealership will tack on another 2 or 3%, onto that. So they'll collect, the difference. And so that's something to really pay attention to, is that you have cars now that cost way more than they used to. The insurance rates are far higher than they've ever been before. And the terms on these cars too, by the way, I think 84 months is like the longest one right now. Like, you can get cars, you're basically paying the equivalent of what a house used to cost. You're not paying any down payment. You're, financing with double-digit interest rates. And it's incredible. There used to be a point in time where our mortgage was $700 and now car payment is, starting at $700. So this is, again, important to pay attention to, because whether you like it or not, America is really based around cars. So if people can't afford cars, they're not going to be able to get to work. It's going to create a lot of problems within the economy. Okay. The next one that's worth mentioning is student loans. So student loan borrowers aren't making payments. There's been a surge in delinquencies, people who aren't current on their loans. That indicates a group of people who either can't make their payments because they're so financially strained, or they frankly won't make their payments. I've seen evidence that suggests there's people who just are choosing not to. There's TikToks and stuff like that people have made, like, proudly claiming they're not going to pay their student loans because they don't think they need to. So this is an analysis I found by AEI, and they said 40% of student loans with NELNet are current. So I use NELNet. But 40%, that means 60% of their borrowers are not current. So, put all this together. You have people in houses that they can't really afford, especially those if they bought at the 2021, 2022 at the height of the post-pandemic boom. You have people who are purchasing cars who they can't afford those payments either, and to no fault of their own. It's just the car prices have gone up so precipitously. And then obviously the resumption of student loans put another strain on resources, so people are struggling to pay their student loans. And so you combine all of this with the fact that there aren't jobs. The jobs that we thought were being created aren't really being created. There's high underemployment. People aren't making enough money to pay their debts to make things meet. I mean, of course, like, when push comes to shove, like, they're gonna, you're gonna have less to go around, less to spend in the economy. So if more of your income that hasn't gone up, like, people aren't just magically getting raises, with the rising cost of living, right? So your income probably stayed the same if you have one. If you're, Gen Z, you probably don't have one because, you're underemployed, you can't find work. So you have insufficient income to meet rising, not only costs of living, but then meeting all of these, your housing, your car, and your student loans, some really big expenses, right? And that's nothing to say of other rising costs like, healthcare. So you have all these things siphoning a limited pool of resources for Main Street Americans, and you got inflation attack onto it. There just isn't enough money. People don't have money to spend. I think this is why you're seeing a rise in people using buy now, pay later apps to pay for things. And you're seeing this being marketed, right? Like, there was DoorDash partnered with Klarna, so you could buy a Chipotle burrito and break it into four payments because people just can't afford to spend money. And so my argument is that based on loan delinquencies and sustained unemployment, it's clear Main Street is already in a recession. The average American household simply does not have the cash flow it needs to cover all of its expenses. And because of that, it can't continue spending like it's expected to. So our entire economy is predicated on consumer spending. We live in a materialistic consumer economy. So if you're not spending money, if all of us don't have money to spend, the engine of the economy as we know it is going to grind to a halt, which I think is what's happening and why we're moving towards a more financialized, a more service-based, a more technologically AI-focused economy, because there's nothing like people can't buy things anymore. They don't have money. People do have time, so they can use their eyeballs to watch content like this. They can, it might be more affordable to license something instead of buying something. So, I think that's one of the reasons why we're moving in that direction. But so for the past few years, Main Street has been sheltering in place under the protection of credit cards. And I think this is really important because this isn't talked about. It creates an illusion that that consumer spending was chugging along just fine. The problem is Wall Street doesn't discern whether revenue is generated from cash or credit. So credit cards, buy now, pay later, whatever you want to call them. I think people have been financing their spending for a really long time to keep up with appearances, to make it seem like everything is okay, everything's hunky-dory. And so they have essentially running out of credit to spend with rising costs and all that stuff, rising debts. There's just you become at some point you become uncreditworthy, and so I think we're reaching that point. And so there's nothing for people to spend, and this has been validated as well. The Wall Street Journal had a piece about this where like 50% of consumer spending is coming from the top 10% of spenders. So the people who are actually propping up the consumer economy right now are wealthy people. So the rest of us are just kind of playing along. We're making it look like it's working. And I think we all know it's not working, and it's starting to become aware that it's not working. But for the vast majority of people, like, we're not, besides, subsistence, food, gas, car insurance payments, the vast majority of us, we're not taking trips. We're not buying, fancy new clothes. Or if we are buying new clothes, it's from a cheap place like H&M and Shein. We're not spending the money like we used to. And so I think the average American household does not have the financial resources to participate in the post-COVID economy. Prices have risen far faster than incomes. The average American who bought a house or car in the last 5 years is paying more than their income can realistically afford. And because of rapid changes in the job market, it's unlikely Americans will get the income earning opportunities they need to become solvent. So I think this is what's happening. Main Street America is in a recession. I don't think that Wall Street, K Street, or Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley are in recessions, because they're just operating in very different economic environments. But I think Main Street is. And now with new data coming out from Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think maybe folks on Wall Street might be starting to recognize something's wrong. And I think folks on K Street also might be starting to recognize something is wrong. I think Silicon Valley's in La La Land, and they're doing their AI thing, and that's all they really care about. But yeah, I think this is important to consider, because, the data has been, the news and the data has been telling us a story of strength in the economy. And then I think we internalize that. I think that's a natural tendency. People internalize things, and it's like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I find a job? There's so many jobs. Everything's so great. Why am I struggling? And reality is we're all struggling, right? We're all struggling with debt. We're all like stressed out about getting groceries, feeling frustrated. You can't do the things you used to be able to do, take trips, whatever. So we're not alone. We're all in this together. Like, this is happening. And so I think the sooner that individually and collectively we recognize that we're in a recession, I think the better off we will be. So that's what I have for you today. If you like this video, I'd love it if you would subscribe. And if you have any thoughts on this, please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And I'll see you in the next video.